Sponsored in part by Pediatric Associates of Dallas. Pediatric Associates of Dallas has been providing excellence in pediatric medicine since 1971. PAD has locations in Dallas and Plano and is now open 7 days a week because taking care of kids is what we do.
The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional legal advice, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your attorney, advocate, physician, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding any medical or educational concerns.
I'll do it. You tell me though.
Good morning. Good morning.
Oh, we're here.
We're here. No, that's
good
live.
Morning.
We're live.
Yeah, we're live. Okay, sorry about that, y'all.
Welcome to Empower Dyslexia, as we're caught off guard. Again, welcome to Empower Dyslexia. I'm Stephen Yearout.
And I'm Rachel Chambers.
And on this show, we discuss dyslexia and related disorders. We talk research. We talk interventions, specialty or special education policy. We talk to experts in the field. We actually have our legislators on and talk to them about state and federal laws that are affecting our children with learning disabilities.
Yes.
As always, we tell you to like us on Facebook and like us and subscribe on YouTube.
Yes.
Because that helps us with our advertisers. And if you're watching this, you're watching it live on either Facebook or YouTube. And then you can also download all of our audio podcasts on all of our preferred apps, whether it be iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Alexa, Stitcher. And we've actually made it on iHeartRadio now.
Yeah,
so I got to add that on here. Yeah, it's amazing. I've been waiting for that to happen. So we're big time now.
Are we big time? Yay!
At least that's what I keep telling myself anyway.
And by the way, we do have subtitles on YouTube for hearing impaired, and if you speak Spanish and read Spanish, so you can change it and read as the show happens. So just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so today we have a wonderful guest on the show. Her name is Dr. Heather Stevens, and she's going to talk to us about a full individual evaluation.
And let me jump in there. So we have a lot of acronyms, speech in special education and in 504, and you hear these acronyms thrown around, and that's what FIE stands for. So when you hear that being used, that's what you understand, that it's a full individual evaluation.
FIE. So Doctor, let me give you a little background on our guest. So since 2001, Dr. Heather Stevens has conducted over 1,000 individual education evaluations through her company, Academic Evaluation and Diagnosis. Since developing her independent practice, Dr. Stevens has consulted with hundreds of different school districts and private schools, colleges, and universities. She frequently works in consultation with other specialists and has provided professional development training for numerous organizations and private schools. She has over 20 years of experience in the field of education. Dr. Stevens, she earned a Master's of Teaching in Special Education from the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. She holds an additional Master's in Psychology and a Doctorate of Education in Supervision, Curriculum, and Instruction Elementary Education with an interdisciplinary minor in Reading from Texas A&M University-Commerce. She has recently completed a specialty program in school neuropsychology. She previously taught general and special education in Dallas Independent School District and served as a master reading teacher and dyslexia coordinator. She really knows a lot, you guys.
So she may or may not know what she's talking about. That's a whole lot of school.
I'm
just sitting here listening to all that school, and anxiety is kicking in. I'm like, oh my God, I couldn't imagine going through all of that.
She is one of my friends, like one of my most well-educated friends that I
absolutely
really
have.
Thank
you.
So we're delighted to have you on the show today, and you're going to tell us all about like the evaluation process and what you guys do to, identify, diagnose these kids, and get them started in the right direction. So we appreciate everything that you guys do and all these well-educated people.
Thank you. Super glad to be here. I appreciate you
Yeah.
asking me.
So,
I was just going to ask if you could, I know that was a long introduction, but could you tell us a little personal information about you? Kind of introduce yourself
or just
also?
tell us a little bit about yourself, whatever.
And
you
why
want.
you say dyslexia. We always ask that question.
Oh gosh. So y'all know all about my bio. I'm a parent. I have 4 children, all in public school. I can tell you why I went into special ed, but it was a long story. Essentially, I really just wanted to be able to help kids. I wanted to be able to provide information and support families. I was a preschool teacher when I decided to go into special education, and I had a little boy that was really struggling, and his parent was really struggling, and I did not know what to tell them. So that was the impetus that made me choose a master's program where I could really specialize in special education. I just didn't want to be in that position again.
Right. I don't blame you. That's, well, thank you. I'm glad you went on to get more education. I wish they taught a little bit more in just the basic, your teaching education about such things. And maybe that's going to come.
Well, I mean,
eventually.
we're working in that direction, right?
I
mean,
hope
it's
so.
it's becoming more and more required that secondary colleges are teaching about dyslexia and adding that into the teacher certification.
And I know it's there a little bit, but I just think there's a big gap there, But, well, that's a whole nother topic.
we got to just keep pushing forward for that. So
Yeah.
let me throw this big question out there because we have this all the time, right?
Okay.
So we've got Section 504, and especially here in Texas, we use that our children with dyslexia are normally steered that direction, I guess is the proper way to say that. And there's testing that's done under 504 for dyslexia. And then you have what's called an FIE, full individual evaluation, that is done through special education. I'll add special education is a service, not a place. So let's make sure that
Correct.
we understand that. But the FIE really takes a look at the full child and capabilities and disability, or strengths and weaknesses, I guess I should say. So can you really help our audience understand if a child is being newly identified and they're having a choice to go which one way or the other, why do they do one or the other?
I can't tell you why. I can tell you what the differences are. So when you're doing a full individualized evaluation, one of the pieces that's really nice about that is when we're doing that through the school system, we are really looking at all the different pieces of that child holistically. So we're gathering a lot of information from the family, sociological information. We're looking at their academic background. Did they go to preschool? Were they read to as a child? Have they had a lot of absences? We're looking at experiences with any potential illnesses. So have they missed a lot of school and they're just behind? We are looking at overall cognitive processing, lots of different types of academic achievement. We are looking at the teacher information and gathering information about how that child has performed over years. So there's all of these different pieces. And the goal of doing a full individualized evaluation is really about bringing that multidisciplinary team and all of those pieces together, and then using that data to determine what is the best way to provide any intervention if that's necessary. When an evaluation is done under 504, not always, but sometimes it's not done with the same instruments or to the same depth and breadth that is done under an FIE. The FIE has certain requirements. An FIE is the legal construct in which a school district must evaluate in all areas of suspected disabilities. So typically it's much broader. Usually, when a school district is performing an evaluation under 504, there is already a diagnosis. Not always, but usually dyslexia is that weird one that
Right.
we're often looking at dyslexia through the 504 lens sometimes, but a lot of times if a student has ADHD or epilepsy or has a history of OHI, which is other health impairment, one of those acronyms for cancer treatment, whatever that might be, there's already a diagnosis in place, and so the 504 committee is trying to determine what the best interventions and accommodations would be. So it's a long answer.
So I know with my own child, my youngest, we saw possibility of dyscalculia, which is done through special education, that testing piece of it. And we did, and I know I probably said that wrong, but whatever.
I don't think
I'm
so.
dyslexic, I can say it wrong.
That's your accommodation.
Yeah, it's my accommodation. I can say it wrong. No. And we went ahead and had him tested for dysgraphia, and just because of the family history, we went ahead and did dyslexia also. But we did all of that under an FIE instead of just saying, hey, we want it done this way under 504. So, and that was his initial evaluation straight off the ball, you know. So would it be better for the parent? I know that this is case by case basis, right?
Sure.
You got to really look at what's going on with the child. Is that level of testing warranted, I guess you could say, right?
It's obviously, this is a broad general statement. I've seen some very, very solid 504 evaluations that are done that answer these questions, but typically it's very helpful because if you do an FIE, you're then getting all of the cognitive processing pieces as well. So we're able to look at that student's unique neurological profile. We're able to say, wow, because of that particular strength or that particular weakness, an instructional program that has these pieces may be a better fit for the student. Having more data is just typically better in terms of being able to design a program unique for that student.
That's individual. That's an individual education plan, IEP.
An IEP, which
So-
is a completely different piece.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, you've already covered kind of like what consists of kind of a good FIE, but what, and you know, differentiated between 504 and the FIE, but what typically is in an FIE evaluation? Once you look at all the data, the history, the social, if they've been sick, all of that relevant history gathering, gathering of history, should I say, what goes, give us an example or tell us what you, just lay it down on it. Lay it out there.
Because you're talking specifically about dyslexia, after you have the information that you've gathered from teachers and parents and looking at the child's academic history, hopefully some RTI information, what interventions have already been done, and what's been successful or hasn't worked. That's the whole purpose of the response to intervention model. I would then look at a full cognitive profile and get areas. We're in Region 10, which typically uses processing strengths and weaknesses. A lot of times we call it a cross battery. It's not exactly the same thing, but those are the terms that people are familiar with. That alone usually has 7, 8 different types of cognitive processing. It's not the same thing as IQ. And then looking at a very deep and broad academic achievement profile, getting that information is important, and then digging more deeply into the areas specifically about reading. So there's these very broad cognitive and achievement batteries, but they're not necessarily as strong as, say, a diagnostic assessment. So then we use both. So looking at those big pieces and then looking at the diagnostic parts or additional tests to really gather information about what is the student's baseline and what are the areas of weakness. You might have a student who, for example, seems like they have very strong reading comprehension. And then you ask them to read orally, and they really struggle with text acquisition and fluency. So all of a sudden, their comprehension is greatly impaired because you realize how laborious that text reading actually is. So without doing that, without getting both of those types of pieces, it's more difficult to design an intervention program specific for the nature of that child.
So, so just recently, my child went through an evaluation, an FIE, and they used the Woodcock-Johnson. Do they use the Woodcock-Johnson on a 504 eval?
Not usually.
I mean, because I don't even know what they use.
It really depends upon the type of people doing the testing. So Woodcock-Johnson, the test company, Riverside, will only sell that instrument to people with certain qualifications. So you have to have certain qualifications and training to administer those tests. There are other instruments that are excellent, but you can be trained without having certain qualifications.
Gotcha.
So those are some differences in the types of instruments that are used.
So to be clear, different districts use different instruments. Is that true? Because I know my district does
I wouldn't
Woodcock.
know specifically about what district uses
Right.
what, but different people within different districts are able to use certain instruments. So for example, in Texas, which is where we are living, in Texas, the two people that typically use these types of instruments, like a Woodcock-Johnson, are licensed specialists in school psychology and certified educational diagnosticians. Those are the two people. In other states, we don't necessarily have those, or they're called something different. But
Interesting. You would think that would just be like everybody would have the same. It's so different than the medical world. It's just so different.
Well, dyslexia is not different in Louisiana or Oklahoma or Washington, D.C.
But the people that can do certain, I mean, it's called different things in different states. It's just kind of
just the name of the professional.
Right. But what I'm saying
it's like
is,
you don't know who you're going to. You're like, well, what are their
we
qualifications?
don't use the different test for strep in different states. Let's get a good battery of tests that everybody can agree that this is the way that we test.
Well, that stems from a lot of research, though.
And let's do it that. I mean, to me, that makes sense. Now, I'm a layperson. I don't know. I didn't go to school.
It may not be that
so
simple, right?
I know that it may not be. But what I'm saying is, if we know that Woodcock-Johnson is a very good test for dyslexia, or to start off with that dyslexia intervention, why aren't we using that across the board to start with?
Oh, gosh. Well, professionals all have their own individual preferences.
Right.
And I use so many different instruments depending upon what I know about that student.
I got you.
So I also look at the rapid naming component, the word retrieval deficits that are common specifically in our population that is going to be more difficult to remediate. The work we have out of Tufts University with Marianne Wolf, we've got that double deficit hypothesis that's going on with some of our population with dyslexia. So if we don't look at rapid retrieval, if we don't look at rapid naming, you're not going to find it. And so having certain pieces is really important. I also will have a student who may have already had certain instruments, and people are asking why this child is still struggling, and I'll go to a completely different battery of tests. So I just happen to use a lot of different things. I look at orthography. I like Virginia Behringer's test, the PAL-2, specifically when a child has already had instruments given to them, and I can't repeat those. But it's not necessarily the first thing I use. So every evaluation is going to be unique and different depending on what I know about that student.
Well, and I'm not saying that
Exactly.
we limit, and maybe that question came off wrong, but I'm not saying we limit the type of tests that we use or the tools, because we want to make sure that you're able to test for what you are seeing as the professional. But if Texas does one thing and Louisiana does another and Georgia does another, and we're not seeing consistent identification across the states that is, consistent with that 1 in 5. I mean, to me, it seems like the testing or the evaluation process could be part of the issue.
True, but you're specifically talking about dyslexia.
Right.
And I will tell you, as someone with a special education background, you would see that from state to state. You would see a lot of differences from state to state. Certain states use an RTI model only. Certain states have different constructs for how they determine whether or not a child has a specific learning disability under federal law. So those state policies are going to differ no matter what. That's
Yeah.
not specific to just dyslexia.
Yeah, I'm just,
I know.
Just-
It would be ideal.
Yeah.
It would be
It's so
ideal if
confusing.
everybody had uniform policies, but it's not, it doesn't exist like that as it is. And we all try to continue with professional development to always know what the expectations are, any changes that have been made, and use best practices in order to
right.
figure out what is going to be the best answer for that particular student. I will say that I've definitely had a lot of individual students who a more minimal evaluation can work for that student.
Right.
It's okay. We can do an evaluation under 504 and have it be a less deep and broad evaluation, and that student can be successful. That student can be placed in an intervention program in schools and be very successful. But there are some students where if we had had deeper, broader information, we might have said, gosh, that program at that pace is not necessarily going to be ideal for that student, and we need to go a different direction. At the same time, I see students very often who've already had different types of remediation and different levels of remediation, and they don't necessarily need an entire full 2 or 3 year program. And we can provide a more efficient service to those students without placing them in a program where they have to go lockstep. So
Right.
all students would benefit from a deeper, broader program, deeper, broader evaluation if we have the flexibility
Right.
to provide more individualized programming on the back end.
I mean, so it really all stems from your FIE of like
Absolutely.
what is recommended, after the evaluation is done. And you guys evaluators, diagnosticians make these recommendations, correct? At the
Yes.
end of the evaluation, so the schools know what direction to go to for this
Yes.
child, what the best tool or intervention or accommodation is needed for that child to be successful.
Exactly.
So
So-
the parents suspect a disability or suspect a issue, a problem that's going on. They see struggling in school, right? Then they request the evaluation, and that's when they come see you, and they go through the testing piece of it, whether it's 504, IEP, whatever, special education. What happens after the test is completed?
So once all the evaluation is complete and the written report is provided to the family, then the ARD committee comes together, and as a group, those individuals, and there's a lot of different people that are part of that ARD committee. Sometimes there's a need to bring in a particular specialist. Sometimes there is a need to bring in a medical professional. It really just depends upon the nature of that student. But it is an important piece to separate the evaluation process from the decision and eligibility at the ARD committee level versus the outcome and placement of that individual. So you can have a student where the concern, the potential area of disability is dyslexia, and the expectation would be to go through the 504 process, but they decide to go through the FIE process under special education. A lot of times that's intimidating to parents. Parents worry about that. They might hear the term special education and they think that's not where my child belongs. I wish we didn't have that feeling, because
Yeah.
special education, first of all, should be far more inclusive. I've had students who are in AP talented and gifted programming who are also in special education. So special education doesn't isn't limited to students with particular potential outcomes, cognitive levels. So it is a service provider from the federal government mandate. That's all it is. And it's a way to pay for programs that are provided and necessary and required by law. So if we could separate the emotional feeling that we have about special education, I think that we could manage those processes a little bit better and make parents feel better about an evaluation. The evaluation process is just to gather the information. It is not to decide what's going to happen.
Thank you for
Correct.
saying that piece
Sure.
of it, right? Because
Yeah.
there is that stigma in special
Absolutely.
education. I mean, I
And there
remember
shouldn't be.
when I was put in special education, and from the student's perspective, I remember looking around the room going, "What am I doing in here? I shouldn't be in here," right? Although I, as a student, and even as a parent, until a couple of years ago, 5 years ago or so, I saw special education as a place, not a service, until I started understanding what goes into all of that, right? And I love that you said that what we're doing is collecting data to make a decision. Because this is mandated or provided under special education, doesn't mean your child will necessarily end up in special education.
Exactly.
They can get serviced under 504 if
Exactly.
that's what they want.
Yes.
That
Two
meaning the
separate
ARD,
processes.
the ARD committee comes together and says, we feel that this child can be served here. And we're just talking about service. We're not talking about protections and everything else. We're talking about my child has a need, and we've done an evaluation, and we feel that this program over here is best suited for my child. So let's don't be scared of the process, right? Let's make sure that we go out and do the full evaluation, full individual evaluation, see what is going on completely with the child, holistically as the child, not am I looking for a specific
Exactly.
disability. So
And so-
that's my soapbox. So.
No, that's
a good
that's
summary.
right. So and I'm going back, I know, so you're collecting all this data, and the parent suspects, well, okay, they have a reading problem. They're not. My child is not reading. My child maybe is not speaking. Like there's a language or speech delay, or my child cannot write, or whatever the parent is communicating, and the teacher says, yes, I agree, I'm seeing the same things. And does that, do you grab certain tools when parents say those particular things and say, okay, well, let's look deeper into that and see if it's maybe dyslexia, or maybe it's a language processing problem, or what have you?
It's a great question. I, as a private evaluator, gather as much information as I possibly can. So I speak with the family over the phone initially. I ask all sorts of questions. What data do we already have? Has the student ever had an evaluation of any type? What are the referral questions? What are the concerns? Describe to me what's happening. Sometimes what someone suspects is actually not the outcome at all. So you just mentioned speech and language. There are frequently times where somebody sees that a child has a reading comprehension difficulty, and so the assumption is, my child has dyslexia. It's not necessarily the case. The child may have a reading comprehension issue, but it's rooted in language. And we don't figure that out unless we're looking at language too. So if I just do a reading comprehension test and I see, yes, the child has a reading comprehension deficit, then we're going to put all the instructional recommendations into building reading comprehension. But if the child's listening comprehension is equally poor, we're actually spending time giving a treatment that may not be the very best outcome.
Right.
And it's a waste of the child's time and efforts on the part of the school. So it's, again, the better option is to really have as much data as you can before you even start the evaluation. And then I try to split up the evaluation as much as possible, so that I'm doing a portion of it and able to score and look at the data and the outcome, because then that drives what I'm going to do the next day or a week later. And I use the information as I'm going. So it's a very fluid, dynamic process, and I can go different directions as I'm gathering information along the way. Sometimes I'll get information. I always ask from the students to get information from teachers and schools. Sometimes I'll get information that comes in from schools and I won't know about that, or the parent didn't know about that, and then that causes me to go a different direction because somebody has a concern that wasn't voiced by the family that I don't have originally.
Right.
So, I mean, it's an investigation. It's a
It's
fluid
a-
investigation where
It
you're
is.
trying to
Total
gather all the
investigation.
facts.
It is.
So when you do a CSI,
Yeah, I was like,
FIE,
you feel like a private investigator.
Dr. Stevens, private eye.
I mean, really. I mean, that's what
I mean,
love
that's
about my
basically what
job.
you're doing. You're taking all the information you're gathering, and you got to put it all together.
And
With this
decipher.
person said this, but wait a second, that doesn't match what this person said, and so we need to dig into that a little bit. So,
I consider it puzzle pieces,
Yeah.
but it's the same principle.
yeah.
Yeah, which is very fun. That's cool. Okay, and so let me ask you this, because you just mentioned, so you separate out your tests, like meaning that you would do, what, say 2 hours of testing one day, and
It depends
on the child.
It depends on the child. I try really hard to work with their schedule and obviously mine. And we want to make certain we're getting the best data. So if it's a very young child, we're going to take a lot more breaks.
Right.
And we may not do as much in one day. If it's an older student and we're looking at a holiday or a half day for them, we might get more done in one day. But it's based upon the kind of data we're getting and productivity from that student.
And you try to make it fun,
Oh,
right?
as much as possible.
As much as possible. It's not like, they're sitting there,
It's
writing.
it's not a STAR exam.
It's also designed to get the best out of that student. The goal is
And
to
then
find out
low stress.
as
You're
much
very-
as possible. I
yeah.
tell all of the students, each and every one that comes in, it's really about getting the best information from that individual. It's about figuring out their strengths and weaknesses. It's about letting them know that they weren't supposed to prepare. They
Right.
shouldn't
There's
have
no
studied.
wrong
There's
answer,
no
per
wrong
se.
answers. And there's also a range. So I let them know that they're not supposed to be able to do everything that we're putting in front of them.
See, that's a great point, and I'm sure that a lot of evaluators do that say, and really the parents really need to hit home also is, hey, this is about to see where you're at. Don't worry about it. Don't stress about it. Go in there and do what you do, and we'll see where we need to pick up the pieces. It's okay. Don't stress about this.
Yeah.
And then they can come in and be them. They can show you who they are and what they need.
I also spend a lot of time interviewing the
Right.
student because particularly in upper elementary, middle school, and absolutely high school and college, the volume of information you can get from that student about what's going on for them in different settings, excuse me, in different settings, and how they know what's working for them. They know what they need to be successful. So with my at least 8th graders and up, I ask them to write a personal statement. So I just simply give them some paper and say, please write and tell me what your strengths and weaknesses are, what you think you do well in, what's easy, what's hard, what are your suggestions of what can be done that might help improve your situation.
So
Excellent.
it's interesting that you say that you do that. You give them the piece of paper and ask for a personal statement. I'm going to throw a little curveball there. How often do you find that these children are able to adequately describe what's going on with them?
Very, very often.
Often, really. Because my mom asked me this question. She was like, I never understood what was going on with you because you always seemed like you were okay with everything and you joked about everything and were happy and whatever, right? But then when I told her what was really going on behind the scenes, she was like, I never knew. So I said, but I couldn't tell you. I didn't know how to tell you at that point. I can now. I can articulate it now, but that's, interesting that you're seeing that most of these kids are able to articulate what's going on.
Well, I'm talking about older students.
Right.
Again, 8th grade and up usually. I'm also talking about students where typically it's not their first evaluation. So they're used to that process.
Okay.
And then the other piece is they may already know so much about themselves. They may have already had support. They may have already been through dyslexia remediation programming, and so they are much more comfortable and confident and have enough explanation that they can
Good.
communicate that.
So you said that, you're 8th grade on up, and I have an 8th grader. They've been typically evaluated in the past. So here's a question to me, because our question to you that was posed to me a few months ago, saying, okay, well, like my son just went through testing, right? And it wasn't based on him. This is another life experience, or a friend, should we say. If we reevaluate the child repetitively, or like say within 6 months or a year, instead of doing it every 3 years, or we're going to have to use a different type of test because they'll memorize the test. Now, is that possible?
Oh, gosh. It would take a lot of effort on the part of the student to memorize the test and frankly, access to that instrument. So,
And they don't have access to that
they
instrument,
shouldn't.
right?
And you
have
don't tell them
access.
you got
No.
something right or wrong. It's just,
We don't.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't tell them. We typically say, I like how hard you're working, great job, are you tired, you seem to be doing well, but not specific to an item
Right.
or a particular test prompt. I will say that it's going to be, the answer to your question is very straightforward. The test publications will say you are not allowed to administer a test more than one time a year, unless there's a different form. So there could be Form A, Form B. Some instruments have multiple forms that are used for response to intervention. But some instruments, you have one form and that's it. And so those are the ones that we cannot administer those. And it's a great question because, again, when I'm talking to a parent on the phone, when they call and ask for an evaluation, I always am saying, what do we know? What data do you already have? If the school has evaluated, if another evaluation has taken place by a private person, then I need to see all of that information. For example, if I had a family from the Hill Country call me 2 days ago, and they've had a school district evaluation, and then a private psychologist did an evaluation this summer, and I said to the parent, I need all of it. If I were going to follow up on a particular instrument that I know has two forms, then I have to either ask the parent to go back to that person, or I have to contact that person with permission from the parent to find out exactly what form was used so I can give the other. Otherwise, I'm invalidating my own testing.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's interesting that there's different forms on different or specific tools. Like they offer you options, really. It's the same test, but just a different way of giving
It's the
it.
exact same test in a different form. So
Right.
different words or different spelling items or different calculation. It just depends on which
Okay.
form.
Well, good. Thank you for answering that, because that has been asked of. I mean, I've come up against that a couple of times in the last couple of year. Well, since we've been doing this podcast.
And
so
I'm often asked to do an evaluation simultaneously that it's being done by a school district. I do a lot of evaluation just because people want a baseline, because people just want the information. They don't necessarily suspect that there's a disability, but they want a
want to make
broad
sure that there
picture.
isn't.
Or there may be family members, or they're just wanting the data. They just want to know strengths and weaknesses of their student and how they best learn. So
I mean, who wouldn't want to know a baseline for my child and where's those weaknesses so we can give them tutoring or help? Not tutoring, but just help. We can help them in those areas.
what's so unique about that is it's usually done from an achievement standpoint, and where it's really helpful from my perspective is when it's done from a cognitive processing standpoint, when we can look at that student's unique neurological profile and say, wow, look at their strategies, look at what they're able to do. And honestly, that comes more from observation and the qualitative data that the evaluator is able to gather during the process of the evaluation. I love to be able to report the qualitative information because, frankly, a lot of times I will have data that is average. The student is average. The student is still average no matter what we want to call
Whatever
it.
test you
It doesn't
do.
matter what instrument is being given. But sometimes what that student is doing to get that average score is far more interesting than whether or not the student is average. So a lot of times it's why. Why is the score what it is? Whether it's low, high, or average, why is that score what it is usually a much more relevant question than what is the score.
So it's very evident to you if they have coping mechanisms that they're using to get to that score. Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes not even coping mechanisms. Sometimes it's an unbelievable cognitive strategy. And there are times when I will stop and ask the student, what are you doing to get the answer? Because it's either so incredibly fast or it's a very laborious process. And I want to know, or I can see that they are physically doing something. So for example, if it's a task of working memory and they're not allowed to use pencil and paper, they will demonstrate some strategy and I'll watch what they're doing physically with their hands. And it's fascinating. Or I watch them and they're writing digits on a table with their finger. Mm-hmm. And so there are processes that they're doing to get the answer. And that alone is really interesting and an important part of who that student is and what they naturally go to. What is their mechanism to be successful?
I write my numbers. If I don't have a pencil, I write it. Okay.
So sometimes the why the data is what it is actually more interesting than
Absolutely.
what the number means in terms of a standard score or a percentile.
And that happens in the classroom, your observation time, or during testing?
No, usually during testing.
Okay.
I will do classroom observations. I was at a private school here in Dallas 2 days ago doing an observation, but you don't get that level of depth that takes watching the student during the evaluation process.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. So tell us about the observation piece of it, because you do all these. Well, two questions. So you do all of the evaluation, the different tests that you pull out of your toolbox. And so do you do the observation personally? I guess everybody has their own way, right? We've discovered that. Every evaluator, diagnostician has their own way of doing their tests. But do you typically do the observation piece first and then or last or in the middle or whenever you can fit it in? Or and then what information do you gather from the observation piece?
It depends.
I mean, it totally depends on the student.
It depends on the student, the school, the referral question. When I do an observation, it is almost always exclusively done prior to the student knowing me, because otherwise they're going to be on edge. They're not going to be comfortable.
So you do it at the beginning.
I do it at the beginning.
So nobody knows
So you're a
who
fly
you
on the
are.
wall.
They don't know who I am.
You could be a parrot sitting in the room.
I could be a parent. I could be an administrator. They don't know who I am. And every once in a while.
And they don't know you're there because
they have
of
no
them.
idea I'm there for them.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, I will have a teacher introduce me and say, she's just here to see what first grade looks like.
Okay.
And that's it.
Okay. Okay.
When kids are younger, I am sometimes a little bit more engaged. I try not to be initially, and it also depends upon the teacher. Mm-hmm. I've done observations in certain teachers' classrooms so many times that they'll occasionally send a kid over to get to know me. So I will have a child coming and asking me a question about what they're doing, and the teacher knows that because I've done that before. And so there's certain places where I engage a little bit more with all the students. So I'm still even under those
incognito.
circumstances, not sitting next to a particular child seeing what they're doing. So usually, like 2 days ago, I was in a middle school setting. So I'm sitting at the back of the room and the teacher's teaching and there's 20 children in the classroom. And some of them, including the student that I was there for, didn't even know I was there the whole time. Other times, I'm much more engaged, and the younger the child, typically the more I'm engaged because it's just easier and it's a more natural situation.
Interesting.
I'm telling you, I'm going to start calling you Dr. Stevens' private eye.
I will say that when you do an observation, there's different things that you're looking for. So if you're worried about a reading issue, I like to go in and see what the child is doing when the teacher is teaching reading.
Right.
And so the teacher and I will coordinate that observation so that the teacher can see, can show me, here's what happens. I had a student, he's probably in high school now because it was a good 10 or 12 years ago, and the student had a really, really savvy kindergarten teacher, and it's the first 3 or 4 weeks of school, and there was a lengthy family history of dyslexia. So the parent called and asked for me to do an evaluation, and the first thing the parent said is, the teacher says she thinks he might be dyslexic because the child's behavior is fantastic all day long, except during that 90-hour language arts block.
90 hour?
No, sorry,
90
90 minute,
like,
that's a long
dang.
time.
That's a
90-minute
long
language
day.
arts block, and she
Right.
noticed a significant change in his level of frustration.
Sure.
And so this savvy teacher was able to really help the family
Yeah.
get an evaluation and get an intervention on board immediately. So that child could be successful, and we would lower his threshold for frustration in that classroom too.
That's wonderful.
And I mean, that falls right into our tagline, right?
Yes.
Partnering, being a better partner in education.
Right.
And it takes all of us, right? It takes the evaluators, it takes the parents, it takes the teachers, the district, everybody to be on board to do the right things for the child, right? That we also have to make sure that we lose sight of this a lot of times. It's about the children, not about bragging rights. It's not about you're right, or I'm wrong. It's about the children and doing what's best for them.
Correct.
Well, I want to make sure we cover something because we were talking about it and kind of brushed over it. When we were talking about the FIE, I said it's a really important distinction for parents to understand what the FIE is supposed to do. But just because you have an FIE does not mean that the child is then going to go into special education or, frankly, even have eligibility
Right.
under special education.
Right.
So the FIE is only supposed to gather all of that information. I will say that the evaluator's job in that process is to pull all of those pieces and identify if a student has the condition of one of 13 categories under federal law. But it is not my job as the evaluator to determine the condition. And that, I'm sorry, to determine eligibility.
Right, okay.
It is my job to determine the
condition.
condition.
Okay.
But it is not my job to decide whether or not that child is eligible. And that's how the ARD committee is supposed to operate, is everybody comes together and discusses all of the aspects of the FIE from all of those different pieces, and then decides what is the best way to serve that child based upon the information we have and the unique neurological needs of that child.
Love it. The best way to serve that child. And that's what we have to do.
And sometimes that is absolutely under 504.
Yeah. And sometimes it's nothing.
Absolutely, that's
Right.
So, that is
Sometimes
so
they're
true.
like,
Yeah, I
Hey,
mean, sometimes
your
it's
child is
really,
golden.
sometimes it's nothing, right?
And frequently the parent chooses to use private intervention regardless, but they want to share the information with the school just so they have it.
Here's a heads up.
I have that a lot.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Quick
It's
question.
just important that one does not necessarily lead to another.
Right.
Just because you have an FIE does not mean that you're automatically moving towards special education.
Right.
It's just a broader, deeper evaluation.
And I have to
That's
say it again, special education is not a place, it's a service.
It's a service.
For specific needs of that child.
Yes, unique
So
needs.
do not be afraid of special education.
Well, and the acronym that you used earlier, or I think Rachel used it, was an IEP, which is Individualized Educational Program. It is supposed to be about that student.
Yeah. So if that entails like pulling out or pushing
Not even
in?
necessarily pulling out.
Okay.
I
Well,
have
yeah, or pushing in. Is that what the terminology?
But it's about what that
Of
student
general
needs. So
education.
I have students who receive special education services and nobody would ever know. There is not a student who is singled out in any way. Other students don't know, and it may be that they're more on a monitor basis and people check in, or they have instructional services that are being delivered in a particular setting, but not in the general ed classroom. I often see students who have what you just described as more of inclusion services, where that special education teacher is in a classroom with the general ed teacher. There's a lot of co-teaching, and that special education teacher is not just working with the students that are in special education. She's also there generally to support the other students. So anyone who raises their hand and asks for help is getting support from both of those individuals.
Okay, good. Okay. So it can be anywhere. Okay. Of course.
They're not going to ignore any child who's asking for help in the classroom.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's what they want to do, is help children.
Exactly.
So
is there anything else in the process that we haven't covered?
well,
that
I
you
would
want
like to
cover?
ask, what are the qualifications to do an FIE? Who is the most trained and qualified to do this type of work that you do?
So it has to be people that have the credentials designed by that state. So the federal law has stipulations on who can do it, meaning we have expectations on who could administer certain evaluation instruments. And people ask this question, they'll bring up things like ITBS or Stanford 9 achievement tests, or private schools often use ERB testing.
Right.
We are not allowed to use the data from those instruments because they're group normed, group administered type of instruments. And so those can be a part of that ARD committee process, and you want to have that data to put into that FIE report, but it's not, we can't use that data to make decisions for special
Correct.
education.
It's too broad.
It's completely different. So we have to use certain instruments with certain technical qualities, and those instruments then require only people with certain credentials. So as I said before, in Texas, the people doing cognitive testing and the deeper, broader academic achievement batteries are LSSPs and educational diagnosticians. In other states, they might be called something else. Certain states don't have diagnosticians, they only have school psychologists.
Okay.
And then speech-language pathologists are the people who are usually using the tests, administering tests for speech-language, pragmatics, expressive-receptive, just like an OT is going to be using instruments specific to their field.
Sure. And all these people are masters trained
Usually-
or bachelors or
A lot of us at this level have doctorates.
Well, of course,
and
like you do.
most.
But what's
not
the low?
most-
What's the minimum?
Oh, a master's.
A
You
master's.
ha-
Okay, that's what I thought.
For a diagnostician or an LSSP, you have to have a master's, and there are many people who have a doctorate.
Okay, that's what I thought. I mean, you guys are highly trained individuals that's your specialty. I mean, you went through years of training to be able to do this. It's not like you're like, I'm hanging a shingle because I want to. You went to school to earn this.
Correct.
And it looks, I just love watching you talk about your eyes kind of light up when you mention like how you do these evaluations. So you really enjoy your job.
I love my work.
Because you probably feel like you're helping a lot of children and families out there in school districts. And I'm sure you'd want to even more if you could, but I know it's probably very rewarding.
It has been.
Difficult, but in some areas, but very rewarding.
The times when it's challenging is when I see a student where there has been concern for years and years and years, and we're late getting intervention provided.
And that's always heartbreaking.
That's very, very frustrating, where it's like, oh gosh, if we had known this information, we could have done this.
And didn't delay testing, and didn't delay intervention, and didn't delay screening, and so on and so forth, or screening first,
Right.
and so on and so forth. So, but, well, it looks like we're about to run out of time. So I appreciate you coming on the show and telling us all your information. Did we cover everything?
The last thing I was asking, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted?
Not that I can think of.
Let me ask you one more question. Because this came up not too long ago. So, can you prescribe ADHD medication? And if you, can you just tell everybody who does that generally?
No.
Yeah, right. Not the
No.
diagnostician. It's the pediatrician your
somebody
doctor.
with a medical degree.
Yes, or a nurse
Someone with an
practitioner like
MD.
myself, or a PA, but preferably somebody that has, if you're a child, has pediatric knowledge and experience.
It's such a great question, because I actually often get referrals specifically from adolescent and child psychiatrists to do the evaluation for ADHD. I will do the evaluation,
Right.
and I will give a clinical diagnosis of an ADHD, but I can't prescribe medication.
Right.
It's way out of my wheelhouse.
Right.
And so that they then go back to someone with that professional training. And then it's an important distinction, because in a public school, if the ADHD is the area under which they might need eligibility for special education, that also is an OHI diagnosis, that is other health impairment, and that form must be signed by someone with a medical background. That again is not me.
So psychiatrist, pediatrician, MD, DO,
Someone with a
NP,
medical
PA,
background.
and that's
Exactly.
it, y'all. That's it.
All them letters.
All them letters, all that
So
alphabet.
we all have different areas of specialty, and that's why it's really important to continue to work and all share
Collaborative
information
team.
and collaborate together.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, Dr. Stevens, PI, we appreciate you coming on our show and being just a phenomenal person and a wealth of knowledge and helping
Yes.
the thousands of kids that you have. I mean, it's an
Yes.
honor for me to know you and know the level that you care about these kids and that you do about your profession. And you've always been such a phenomenal source of resources, right?
Yeah, for both of
Gosh,
us.
Right.
thank you.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure.
We hope to have you back on, please. I mean, it's an open invitation to come back on and, help our parents, because that's what we're about, is helping our parents understand the process, not be afraid of the process, and move down the road to see if we need to be able to get some extra help in certain areas. So thank you again from me and Rachel for
Yes.
being on the show.
Yes.
Thank you.
I also want to say, as we say at the end of our show every time, again, don't be afraid of the process. If you suspect that your child has a learning disability, or there's something that's not right, they're struggling in school, we have templates on our website, www.empowerdyslexia.info, that you can download. You can fill these out, turn them into your campus counselor to get the process started. You'll be happy that you did. Your child will be happy that the process is underway and understanding what is going on with them so they can feel whole.
And successful.
Yeah. I mean, that's what it's about.
Success. Yes, we want all kids to succeed. So, okay. So I guess that's all the time we have today. So thank you so much for joining us. And next week we have, I think we're going to be talking about math a little bit with, I did not look, I'm so sorry, but we are going to be talking about dyscalculia a bit. And I want to get you the name, but
We'll post it.
We'll post it, but it's Adrian Meldrum. We're going to talk about dyslexia and math and how those two kind of relate. So stay tuned for next week. Okay,
We'll
y'all.
see you there.
Y'all have a great weekend. Bye.